Starting in the late 1990s, my students and I really began to work extensively on the history of slavery and memories of enslavement within especially the original campus. The large Emory University campus, for those of you who are familiar with it, presents, like many of our institutions, a sort of frictionless surface to history. It almost as if history has been annihilated in certain senses, because there's an enormous surplus of its history, especially of its antebellum history, on its original campus about 40 miles due west of the city of, due east of the city of Oxford, Georgia, where the college began. And that's a smaller institution where I was teaching, though also doing some teaching on the main campus. And for many of the institutions where we work, of course in the South, it's going to be different when we hear from Jim and the question of entanglements in the slave trade, but cemeteries are often very key sites. And my students and I began to do different works in the cemetery, but we were also fascinated by the dominant, as it were, white mythology of the institution, in which it's fascinating, as in so many Southern, predominantly white, historically white institutions of higher learning, there often are figures of color, certain beloved, as it were, retainers, either under Jim Crow or or in slavery times. So the story of Miss Kitty, an enslaved woman who lived from about 1821 to 1851, who actually is written up in the Methodist Book of Discipline, because as Leslie mentioned, the founding Bishop Andrew of Emory College, the first president of the Board of Trustees, his slave-owning status was the precipitating cause of the Great Schism, 1844 schism in the Methodist Church. And the story of those enslaved women, men and women, has been one that has long fascinated me and my students. And because Kitty is written up so often in hundreds and hundreds of white sources, including the university's official histories, as having refused manumission in 1841 out of loyalty to her white. And there are, in fact, monuments, as we'll see. The white community, closely tied into many of the leading white families connected to the university and its board, some years ago very lovingly restored her slave quarters, of course called the servants' quarters, or Kitty's cottage. And we became fascinated, my students and I, these were really freshmen, in that history. There's an important monument that's put up in the late 1930s, particularly at a moment when there was an enormous crisis over the sectional reconciliation of the Methodist Church, enormous anxiety, of course, within the leadership of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which was in many ways intellectually centered at Emory, that this would lead to a breakdown of segregation as we knew it. And the then Chancellor of the University, Warren Candler, in fact, precisely argued that if this particular history of Miss Kitty is not remembered properly, and we don't hold the line here at Emory, we will see segregation fall within a generation. So there's a monument that has it's built, this sacred tablet in the cemetery where so many of the 19th century, almost all the 19th century presidents. So we did a lot of work spatially marking sites of the memory, in some cases acknowledged or repressed, of enslavement. The fascinating writing on the landscape that you'll see here at this very important graveyard. There's an African-American half of the cemetery. And until 2000, when our students really began to work aggressively on challenging this particular form of local apartheid, it was impossible for persons of color to be buried on that side of the trees, with the exception of Miss Kitty herself, who had been, essentially because of her supposed loyalty, this was written up, as I say, in many university histories, was allowed to be buried within the white cemetery. So the only person of color who's officially acknowledged to be buried. Our students got very heavily involved in the struggle across this town to challenge both the dominant historical narrative, but this also led them into work, as these things often do, into environmental racism, and even before the Transforming Community project that Leslie has led began in at least raising questions about the organization of labor and class relations, which of course have been so long racialized within the university. Emory is sometimes termed, not so playfully, as a latter-day plantation, and this kind of language, of course, has a long and fascinating history. We worked on the different successive histories of enslavement. In many ways, one could argue that the 1836 founding of Emory College was to provide, first and foremost, ideological and especially theological legitimation for the institution of slavery, at a point that was increasingly contested. And we were able to identify the students doing a lot of work in the archives and so forth, the major slave owners among the faculty and early administration, and we were able to identify by name about 50 enslaved men and women who had built the original college. And because of the extraordinary circumstances in a place like Oxford, Georgia, many of those descendant families have been in place or have descendants living, still working at the college in some cases, 5 or 6 generations onward. So there's an enormous amount of historical memory, as well as plenty of historical repression in some ways. So our students had access to very rich oral historical research, as well as extraordinary documentary work as we began to identify different enslaved peoples, work through genealogies, which took us in to a more recent history, working with persons who have been enslaved by people like Bishop Andrew and Alexander Means, himself a president of the 19th century president of the institution, tracing through their descendants who in many senses worked at the college and continued to care for it and nurture it. And in very fascinating ways were the repositories of institutional memory, even though they were, of course, continuously exiled. Their children could not attend the institution until the 60s and so forth, and yet, in many senses, saw themselves in caretaker roles across the space of 170 years. Every day brought something extraordinary, and for those of you who've done this work with your students know that there's a sort of riveting excitement along with a profound sense of responsibility that comes. We were tracing through one family, the documentary record, and then actually found one of her descendants' headstones. She'd been enslaved, we knew, by a mid-19th century professor of mathematics. And on this side, as you can see, we first uncovered this because it was all covered with privet. There'd been a lot of neglect of the historically African-American cemetery, in contrast to the pristine white cemetery adjacent to it, where so many of the white leaders of Emory College are laid to rest. Faithful servant in the family of Professor George Washington Stone. And then on the other side, it's a little hard to, sorry, I don't have that slide, there was simply the name Louisa Means, which we learned from family lore later, had been secretly inscribed a few days later, actually, after her interment by the white family, the former slave owners, by her African-American family. The lines got extremely complex. It turns out, of course, that many of the 19th century white presidents of Emory had African-American families as well as white families, and many of those descendants came back for a major exhibition opening that we did on this history, which was deeply moving. Our students did a lot of work restoring the cemetery, this particular cemetery, planting flowers. It was a good connection between our different campuses, but also doing a lot of documentation work with local African-American congregations who took very seriously their responsibility as community historians. We've been able to do a certain amount of online publishing, websites, and so forth, citing the sites, working on marking different places on the land with trees and so forth, trees of remembrance and so forth. There's yet no memorial, in contrast, as we'll hear from perhaps from Al at UNC or other sites, to the enslaved peoples or the peoples of color who, under segregation, built the institution. I don't think there's any memorial anywhere yet. And yet there's an enormous amount of living history that continues, and there are exhibitions which have websites and so forth.